Dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you warmly to the third WZB Distinguished Lecture. The Distinguished Lecture Series of the Berlin Social Science Center aims at bringing internationally acknowledged top-notch scholars to Berlin to engage in interdisciplinary dialogue. And after the sociologist Neil Flickstein and the economist Thorsten Persson, tonight Professor Robert O. Keohane, Princeton University, will speak to us. His lecture will be followed by two discussants from the WZB, both of them with a different disciplinary background. There is Dr. Sonja Alonso from our department, Democracy and Democratization, and Professor Steffen Huck. He is the director of the Department Economics of Change. Each of them will discuss the presentation briefly and possibly critically, and after a short response to these inputs, we will open the floor and welcome your questions. We plan to end at about 7 and then have a reception outside to which you are heartily invited. At this point, I should also add, and I need to add, I was told that I need to add, that the whole session will be recorded, but you will be seen, the audience will be seen only from the back, so if you don't like this, you have to leave now the room, essentially. Robert Keohane will speak about counter-multilateralism, a strategy to change established multilateral institutions via international institutions. And this theme is indicative of a fundamental change in the discipline of international relations. In the 1970s, international relations experienced a sort of a first paradigmatic shift from the war and peace paradigm, which was for a very long time the major theme of international relations, to something that may be labeled cooperation paradigm. With the rise of interdependence, with the need to manage East-West relations, the interest of this discipline in international relations moved very strongly in the direction under which conditions can states cooperate with each other, even in the condition of anarchy. And currently, I would argue that a second fundamental shift can be discerned due to the by now relatively high level of institutionalization, relatively not to the nation state, but relatively to the past. It is so that questions in our discipline focus increasingly on something that is labeled global governance, that is essentially the development of the global institutional order. And in doing so, the assumption, the for a long time constitutive assumption for our discipline that everything takes place under anarchy is essentially challenged. And no one can be a better proof of this second shift than Robert Keohane, since he has been now for 4 decades, or most of the time I would say, the leading scholar and thinker in international relations. And ladies and gentlemen, it would take really too long if I would list now the entirety of his achievements. It would have certainly the sort of counterintuitive effect that I would speak longer than he does, and that is something that nobody wants, I can promise you. I want to focus essentially only on 4 aspects of his personality, and very briefly. Let me start out with the first one, which is the formal one, and this I do in a very sketchy form. I mean, he has been, among other positions, professor at Stanford, Harvard, and Princeton. That sounds good. He received many prizes, among them the Skytte Prize, the Groemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, and the Centennial Medal of the Harvard Graduate Schools of Arts and Sciences. No question, his reputation as IR scholar is unmatched. He is consistently ranked as the most influential scholar of international relations by Foreign Policy magazine. So, I mean, that's to the side of reputation, so to speak. Secondly, and more substantially speaking, he has been without question the most important person in establishing the cooperation paradigm that I was talking before. His 1970 book with Joan I, Power and Interdependence, and even more so, his book After Hegemony are classics, both of them still obligatory readings in all reading lists for any student of international relations. And now the most fascinating thing comes, in my view at least. He has been still leading the discipline in essentially challenging his own paradigm. He has been the one who asked the kind of questions, what happens now if we have an institutionalized world order? And in that sense, I would say someone who is leading in transforming a paradigm that he himself has brought into being is really overwhelming in terms of intellectual curiosity and power. My third aspect, my third point, is that I do know many of his PhD students. Most of them are very successful academics. All of them I know well were excited and happy about his role as advisor. Nobility and fairness are the terms that are mentioned most often in this context, besides being demanding, of course. But this is not all. He quite deliberately helped to develop the full potential of a group of female scholars in their generation. Bev Simmons, Helen Milner, Lisa Martin are probably the best known of them. And in that sense, he is to a significant extent responsible for the fact that international relations is not anymore just a male discipline. In this sense, my third aspect is he is a sort of an academic role model. And finally, and clearly least important, I want to add a personal note. I had the honor to be part of his and Joe Nye's group at the Center for International Affairs in Harvard in the 1990s, and there is no question I owe a lot to this time. Yet completely independent of this direct interaction, I can also say that just as an author, he is among the 5 contemporary social scientists that have influenced my own thinking most. His peers in this group are people like Jon Elster, Jürgen Habermas, Barrington Moore, and Charles Tilly. For this reason, I proudly welcome Robert O. Keohane to the WZB. Thank you so much, Bob, for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mikhail, very much. It was a lovely introduction. It's great to be in Berlin, a city that's a favorite city of mine. It's a privilege to speak at the WZB, and especially since Mikhail invited me and introduced me. As he mentioned, we've known each other for, actually he didn't quite mention, 20 years, so we go back a long way together. This talk is based on a new and unpublished paper with a graduate student at Princeton, Julia Morse. And this, I'm exploiting you tonight because this is the first presentation of the argument. So I'm hoping to exploit the discussants and everybody else in the room with comments and criticisms. There are bound to be flaws and shortcomings anytime one speaks for the first time on a topic. I'll also be happy later to discuss general issues of world politics and American leadership and foreign policy, topics I've been talking about at more general locations in the question period. Mikhail, can I have a little bit of water? I might need it in the middle. I don't want to have to interrupt myself to do it. My first couple of minutes will parallel what Mikhail said, actually. 30 years ago, scholars of world politics showed how cooperation could emerge from what was called then anarchy, the lack of common governance. Thank you. When governments could foresee benefits for themselves from cooperation and could overcome problems involving information and the cost of making agreements. Such theories, however, assumed as a starting point an absence of established institutions with rules governing state behavior within specified issue areas. The problem, in Kenneth Oye's words, was cooperation under anarchy. But anarchy does not describe contemporary world politics. Multilateral institutions defined as persistent and connected sets of rules, formal and informal, that prescribe behavioral roles, constrain activity, and shape expectations are deeply ingrained. The problem now is less cooperation under anarchy than cooperation in a crowded institutional space. World politics is more thickly institutionalized than ever before, with many more multilateral organizations and fewer issue areas that lack multilateral institutions entirely. The pervasiveness of institutions means that states, intergovernmental organizations, or coalitions, including non-governmental organizations, can use alternative institutions to challenge the institutional rules with which they are dissatisfied, or even create new institutions to deal with the same problems. These new institutions can take new forms. They can operate more as networks than as hierarchies. New institutions may enter into cooperation with status quo institutions, or may induce changes in the older institutions, in either case changing the rules that govern the issue area. Yet radical change is rare. Institutions often keep being used when situations change or only marginally adapted instead of being replaced. Counter-multilateralism involves the use of different multilateral institutions to challenge the rules, practices, or missions of existing multilateral institutions. When counter-multilateralism, which is a term I think I invented last spring, occurs, what had been an issue area governed by an integrated international regime becomes institutionally contested, not simply between a multilateral institution and states or non-state actors, but between different multilateral institutions with different memberships and different purposes. As a result, interinstitutional conflict is inherent in counter-multilateralism. Now, I regard counter-multilateralism as an important contemporary phenomenon, not merely an intellectual curiosity, and I'll try to persuade you this evening of that proposition. It can be observed across many different issue areas in international relations, including areas such as anti-terrorism and non-proliferation that are central to state security. It's not simply a marginal or political economy phenomenon. Counter-multilateralism is so pervasive in contemporary world politics that the strategies of dissatisfied powerful states on core issues of national security often run through multilateralism rather than in opposition to it. This talk represents an initial attempt to define and describe counter-multilateralism and explore the circumstances in which it is likely to appear. I first specify some essential conditions for counter-multilateralism and distinguish two basic types. I'll talk about these. Regime shifting of the venue from one regime to another, and competitive regime creation, creating a new set of rules and practices in place of the existing ones. The paper from which this talk is drawn also discusses controversies over intellectual property rights and energy issues. In conclusion, I'm going to sketch some implications of counter-multilateralism for theories of world politics, using another example to make my point, that is the Proliferation Security Initiative of the George W. Bush administration. So first, some definitions, distinctions, and conditions. So four criteria define a situation as involving counter-multilateralism. First, there must be a set of actors, including but not necessarily limited to states, that is involved in a status quo institution, either by participating in the institution's mission or because the institution's established rules and practices affect its interests. So there's already an institution which involves a set of actors, including states. Secondly, dissatisfied with the status quo institution, a coalition of actors pushes new rules or policy through an alternative institution or creates a new institution to challenge the status quo body. Thirdly, the rules and institutionalized practices of a challenging institution, whether it previously existed or is new, conflict with the rules and practices of the status quo institution with respect to the same entities or establish a different and at least partially conflicting mission. There has to be some conflict, some discord between them. And fourthly, some actors under the jurisdiction of both the status quo institution and the challenging institution follow, at least for some period of time, the rules and practices or pursue the mission of the challenging institution. That is, there's some defection from the established institution. So counter-multilateralism always involves the use of either an established or a new multilateral institution to challenge a status quo institution. But the outcome of such a challenge is open-ended. I'm not assuming that this succeeds. These challenges can collapse without long-term impact. They can lead to fundamental changes in institutional practices, or they can generate new institutions. Some challenges may have an impact only over a long time horizon. A dissatisfied coalition composed primarily of weak states, for example, may only be able to mount a symbolic challenge to an existing multilateral institution, critiquing an institutional practice, but being unable to force immediate change. Over time, however, such a challenge may change actor preferences, ideas, and values in a way that delegitimizes an institution, forcing concomitant change or institutional exit. In terms made famous by the late Albert O. Hirschman, counter-multilateralism can be seen as a combination of exit and voice that allows states and non-state actors to pursue outside options without dismissing multilateral cooperation as such. Hirschman emphasizes that the prospect of exit may amplify voice. Compared to unilateral withdrawal, counter-multilateralism offers the promise of a successful strategy for achieving this effect. Threats of unilateral exit by powerful states may be seen as so arrogant and uncooperative that they generate resistance instead, while threats of exit by weak states are ineffective. But threats to set up a different organization, to use multilateralism against itself, so to speak, may be more effective. Since it involves coalition building, counter-multilateralism may provide opportunities for voice while keeping the option of exit open, thus amplifying voice. Let me talk then now about some baseline conditions for counter-multilateralism. For states and non-state actors to engage in counter-multilateralism, 3 baseline conditions are essential, which I take as given and don't try to explain. There must be an institutionalized regime in a given issue area, as I mentioned. Counter-multilateralism cannot occur where multilateral institutions do not already exist or where there are competing forums and no agreed-upon standards. So it doesn't exist in the contemporary election monitoring regime. There are 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different election monitoring regimes, and none of them has become established. These are situations of contestation about the type of regime to devise, not, as I define it, counter-multilateralism. The second baseline condition is that some actors are dissatisfied with the institutional status quo and have chosen to challenge it. The dissatisfied coalition may be limited to states or may include a combination of state and non-state actors, such as intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, or multinational corporations. The final baseline condition is that the status quo institution is blocked to some extent, such that the dissatisfied coalition cannot change the institution through purely internal mechanisms. If it can succeed in voting things differently within the institution, it doesn't need to set up a new one. Multilateral conventions and treaties are especially hard to change. So even when countries successfully negotiate revisions, such changes often take years before they take effect. And very often, a blocking coalition will prevent a fundamental change in the current institution. So then, for there to be counter-multilateralism, the challenging coalition, now being blocked from smooth changes in the status quo institution, must have an alternative to the existing institution that would serve its interests. And the coalition must be able to credibly threaten to use this alternative organization in practice. That is, the dissatisfied actors need an outside option. So they're blocked inside, there's an existing institution, and they have some kind of plausible outside option, or think they have some sort of plausible outside option. Now, one might ask, if dissatisfied actors have an outside option, why don't we expect the existing institution to adapt? The authority, its scope of authority, and its impact would be adversely affected if there's defection by certain states. If these states have an alternative outside option, one might expect never to see counter-multilateralism, because existing institutions would adapt smoothly, recognizing they had to change in order to avoid a challenge. But, as we know, institutions don't always adapt. Existing institutions may fail to adapt. Their leaders may lack accurate information, or there may be sharply diverging state interests, or there may be some ideational or institutional constraints that prevent a smooth adjustment to the preferences of newly powerful and engaged actors. Other states may simply block changes desired by the challenging coalition because they see their own interests on substantive policy or institutional authority threatened by change. Or institutions may themselves resist change because such changes might result in loss of authority or autonomy, or organizational change may be opposed by internal bureaucracies. So sometimes you have a situation then where you have an established institution, it's threatened by a coalition which is dissatisfied, which has an outside option, and yet the established institution does not simply compromise and concede the way. Those are the conditions under which we observe counter-multilateralism. I mentioned briefly, I'll come back to it now, there are in my view, two basic types of counter-multilateralism. there's always a coalition that's challenging. But the most familiar type is regime shifting. It's a term that Lawrence Helfer has used. This occurs when challengers to a set of rules and practices shift to an alternative multilateral forum with a more favorable mandate and decision rules, and then use the new forum to challenge standards in the original institution or reduce the authority of that institution. Regime shifting can be found across issue areas. It includes the effort by developing countries and UN agencies to challenge the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property, which was foisted on them by the rich countries. The creation of the Basel Committee and other innovations in global financial regulation, another example of regime shifting. And the World Bank's entry into global health governance, regime shifting from the WHO to the World Bank. But counter-multilateral challenges can also be led by states or by institutions. In either case, multilateral institutions issue rules or policies that directly conflict with international standards established by other multilateral institutions. So institutional-led regime shifting is an important development because institutions are not subject to the same political pressure as states, may therefore be willing to go further in their challenges. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk at some length about the European Court of Justice's challenges to the UN Security Council's anti-terrorism policy. Because despite the fact that the policy had been endorsed by France and the United Kingdom as members of the Security Council, the ECJ challenged that policy and challenged it successfully in a classic case of counter-multilateralism. The second form of counter-multilateralism is competitive regime creation, which occurs when a coalition of dissatisfied actors creates a new institution or establish a new informal form of multilateral cooperation to challenge the existing institutional status quo. So in this form of counter-multilateralism, the challenging coalition will first create a new multilateral institution or forum that more closely represents its own interest. This may be achieved by limiting membership to a select group of states with similar preferences, by establishing informal channels to influence institutional policy, or by creating new transgovernmental networks. The coalition will then use the new institution to challenge existing organizations or networks, generating discord that may or may not lead to interinstitutional cooperation. So I'm going to talk away from those abstractions and talk about counter-multilateralism in practice, give you a sense of what I'm talking about with two prominent examples. One of them, as I mentioned, comes from the European Court of Justice challenge to the UN Security Council regulations on terrorist finance, and the other involves the World Health Organization and challenges to WHO dominance of health policy, especially in the 1990s. These, to me, are kind of quintessential examples of counter-multilateralism, and they're both in important issue areas. So my example of institution-led regime shifting is this challenge by the European Court of Justice, the Security Council, sanctions regimes regarding terrorist financing. What this study shows is that autonomous international organizations such as courts may engage in counter-multilateralism without guidance or initiative from states. They need not have states behind them. The Security Council's failure to anticipate the ECJ's challenge illustrates that information asymmetries can be a key determinant of counter-multilateralism. After 9/11, or actually before 9/11, reinforced after 9/11, the UN Security Council made targeted sanctions a core component of its global anti-terrorism policy. Under the 1267 regime, named for the Security Council resolution of that number that first established it, which was before 9/11, UN member states are required to freeze the assets of all listed individuals and entities affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Although the 1267 regime was initially focused on a small number of Taliban officials and Osama bin Laden, in the weeks following 9/11, the Security Council added close to 100 names to the sanctions list. By January 2002, the Security Council had broadened the sanctions criteria so that countries could propose for inclusion on the targeted sanctions list any individuals or entities associated with, very loosely, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban. From its earliest days, this regime suffered from incomplete implementation by member states. Few countries had actually the administrative and legal structures in place to enforce the measures. The Council provided states with only small amounts of identifying information, making it hard to differentiate the individuals who were to be sanctioned from others with similar names or birthplaces. Moreover, some countries remain entirely ignorant of their obligations under the regime. For many established democracies, however, the biggest implementation challenge was the fact that Security Council obligations conflicted with domestic rule of law principles. Despite concerns expressed, especially in Europe, the Security Council made only minor adjustments to the regime in the first few years of its existence. Although some states were dissatisfied with the UN Security Council's counterterrorism policy as early as 2002, these states, Denmark for example, did not have a viable outside option and therefore were unable to push through major change. So it looked as if the Security Council would have its way. In fact, the formal legal rules say that Security Council regulations under Chapter 7 override any other international legal agreements. But the situation changed when the European courts stepped in. In December 2001, a Saudi national named Yassin Abdullah Qadi filed suit in the European Court of First Instance to request annulment of the European regulation implementing the sanctions. Because after all, the sanctions were UN sanctions implemented by the European Union. That's a key point here. The Court of First Instance ruled against Mr. Qadi in 2005. It took their time doing so, finding it did not have jurisdiction to review indirectly the validity of the UN Security Council regulation. They said, which was kind of expected, UN Security Council regulations trump. We don't have any authority to review UN Security Council regulations. End of story. But Qadi appealed the judgment to the European Court of Justice, which had the authority to invalidate the European Union's implementing regulation and thus affects the sanctions policy of its members. In January 2008, an ECJ Advocate General issued an advisory opinion suggesting that the European regulation implementing the 1267 sanctions measures infringed on the right to be heard, the right to judicial review, and the right to property, all guaranteed by the European Constitution as interpreted by the courts. And in December 2008, the court struck down the European Union legislation implementing the Al-Qaeda sanctions measures. They couldn't strike down the UN Security Council resolution, but they struck down implementing measures, so it made it impossible, would have made it impossible for Europe to implement those measures. The decision was stayed. The European Union passed a new resolution to implement the measures against Mr. Qadi, but it now became clear that the whole sanctions regime was at risk. So you have an instance of counter-multilateralism, the use of the European Court of Justice and therefore the EU against the UN Security Council regime. In the light of the ECJ's adverse judgment and the prospect of challenges to the revised rules, EU rules from Qadi, who was not finished yet, the Security Council looked for new ways to improve due process. And in 2009, the Security Council created an Office of the Ombudsperson to receive delisting requests directly from individuals, granting this individual, the ombudsperson, the authority to review such cases and report her observations to the 1267 Committee. The committee, which operates by consensus that includes all Security Council members, would then decide whether to delist an individual. So for the first time, they created some possible pathway toward an appeals process. In December 2010, though, the European General Court annulled the European Union's later 2008 regulation implementing the sanctions from the 1267 regime, holding that it violated Qadi's rights to defense, judicial review, and property. Even the revised rulings weren't enough. The court acknowledged that judicial review of Security Council measures at the national or regional level could potentially encroach on the Security Council's prerogatives under Chapter 7 and Article 103 of the UN Charter, but it followed the precedent set by the ECJ in 2008. The European Commission then appealed the General Court's judgment to the ECJ. Security Council now had received multiple signals from the European courts. If the Council did not make significant changes to its regime on terrorist financing, the ECJ would likely make it impossible for European states to implement the sanctions, which then would make the sanctions virtually meaningless. In other words, the issue of credibility of the European courts had been resolved. In 2011, the Security Council expanded the powers of the ombudsperson by allowing her to make recommendations rather than simply observations. More significantly, if the ombudsperson reviews a delisting request and recommends delisting to the 1267 Committee, the committee must have a consensus to override the request. So it used to be, and from 2001 on, that the committee, the Security Council had to be unanimous to delist anybody. One country, read the United States often, could block any delisting. But now it was reversed. If the ombudsperson said delist somebody, it would take a unanimous vote, which is almost impossible to get, to refuse to delist that person. So the ECJ has successfully forced significant change in the procedures of the most powerful multilateral institution in the world, the UN Security Council, whose procedures were supported by the United States, the most powerful state in the world. Since the appointment of the ombudsperson in 2010, 26 individuals have been delisted through this process, and only 3 requests have been denied. In October 2012, the Security Council removed Kadi after his 11-year battle from the 1267 sanctions list. In March 2013, the Advocate General of the ECJ issued an advisory opinion recommending that the ECJ set aside the judgment of the General Court and dismiss the action brought by Kadi. So they said, okay, now we've solved the problem. The Advocate General wrote, the judgment of the Court of Justice in Kadi led to the establishment of the Office of the Ombudsperson, which has made it possible to raise the quality of the list considerably. It would be paradoxical if the court failed to take into account the improvements to which it has directly contributed. This looks like then at this point a brilliantly successful, although long drawn out, example of counter-multilateralism, in which the European Court of Justice succeeded in getting a fundamental change in Security Council procedures. But the story actually isn't over yet, because the ECJ didn't follow the advice of the Advocate General and instead has launched its most direct counter-multilateral challenge yet. In July of this year, it issued its decision on the Kadi II appeal, upholding the European General Court's decision to strike down the EU regulation implementing sanctions against Kadi. And not only did it reaffirm its right to review all European Union measures implementing UN Security Council resolutions, but also suggested that nothing short of an external court, not just an ombudsperson, will provide sufficient due process for listed individuals. So here we have a case where the European Court, taking European rule of law principles, not only successfully challenged and forced major changes in the Security Council procedures, but now is pushing even further for an external court. This is, to me, an exemplary case of counter-multilateralism, and it probably illustrates better than my generalizations what it means. I'm now going to turn to, but it's a case of regime shifting, because you already had the European Court of Justice, you already had the Security Council. It was a matter of shifting the venue from the Security Council and international rules to the European Court of Justice with European due process rules. And what about the other form, competitive regime creation? When a dissatisfied coalition cannot turn readily to an established multilateral institution to challenge the practices that it opposes, it may create a new multilateral forum with different rules and practices that more closely align with its interests. To ensure that the new forum has a more favorable policy orientation, the coalition may opt for direct control strategies, such as limiting membership to like-minded states, establishing informal channels of control, or structuring voting in a favorable manner. Alternatively, the coalition may create an institution with a mandate that's more consistent with the interests of its members. By challenging the institutional status quo, the dissatisfied coalition creates additional bargaining leverage vis-a-vis the status quo institution. So I'm going to discuss 2 examples of this. They're related. They both involve the World Health Organization, or WHO. So I'm moving now from the security area to the area of health. Since the San Francisco Conference in 1945, the WHO has been the central UN organization dealing with health issues. And for the first 30 years of its existence, its preeminence was largely unchallenged. This began to change in the late 70s and 80s when the G8 began to consider health issues, marking the start of a period in which the WHO faced a series of challenges to its authority. Coalitions of states and non-state actors initiated challenges to WHO preeminence on 3 issues, 2 of which I'm going to discuss this evening. First of those is the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, otherwise known as Gavi. It's not a wine. It's an alliance. Beginning in the early 1980s, many public health officials became committed to the idea of harnessing advances in biotechnology to produce revolutionary vaccines for debilitating diseases in the developing world. As a central multilateral institution for global health issues, the WHO was a natural organization to coordinate the effort. It established two separate vaccine programs, one focused on basic research, the other on delivering vaccines to children in the developing world. The flaws in this bifurcated approach to vaccine development became apparent as the programs grew. Coordination between these programs was weak, and neither had a mandate to facilitate the commercial production of usable drugs and vaccines. By the late 1980s, health advocates and non-governmental organizations were calling for a more holistic mechanism for vaccine development. In 1990, a coalition of 5 non-state organizations, so here we have non-state groups, UNICEF, which is an international organization but largely influenced by private actors, WHO, I've mentioned, the UN Development Program, which is interstate, the World Bank, and the Rockefeller Foundation, a non-state organization, reached an agreement to form a new children's vaccine initiative, CVI, designed to advance the full continuum of vaccine development. WHO at first resisted the CVI. Once it became clear that the initiative was inevitable, it managed to make CVI a subordinate entity within the WHO. So here's a case where counter-multilateralism was avoided. You got a challenge, WHO adapted, incorporated the CVI in it. But the CVI did not thrive within the WHO, which prioritized its own vaccine programs, constrained the CVI's attempts to partner with private industry, and appeared satisfied to let CVI flounder. Once again, external concern grew about mismanagement of the vaccine effort in WHO. In the late 1990s, a coalition of concerned parties, including NGOs, made a high-profile effort to wrest control of the vaccine initiative away from WHO and move it to the World Bank. WHO leaders, this is a classic misjudgment, perhaps underestimating the extent of dissatisfaction with their own organization, responded by trying to defeat the challenge and reassert WHO dominance over vaccines. In 1999, as one author says, quote, WHO shockingly announced that the CVI would be dismantled and terminated by the end of the year. They just wanted to get rid of it. But it didn't work. Civil society organizations, public health advocates, and some elements of the vaccine industry responded vigorously to the WHO response. Not long after the termination of the CVI in 2000, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Initiative, Gavi again, was created outside of the structure of WHO with significant support from the Gates Foundation. Gavi has been much more successful than CVI was in working with industry and civil society. It receives funding from capital markets, donor countries, and its partners, which include now WHO, as well as the Gates Foundation and the World Bank. So Gavi emerged because of organizational resistance by WHO and an information asymmetry that prevented WHO leadership from accurately assessing the seriousness of the challenge. WHO's resistance to the CVI in the face of a powerful supportive coalition helped generate counter-multilateralism, another classic case of it. The creation of Gavi, which challenged WHO's dominance of vaccine development and delivery. WHO has continued to function as a partner in Gavi, but the counter-multilateral challenge succeeded in significantly reducing its authority over vaccine coordination. The other WHO example I want to talk about briefly is the creation of UNAIDS, a UN AIDS operation. WHO was slow to recognize and respond to the threat posed by HIV/AIDS. It initially viewed the disease as a problem for the richest countries and dismissed the need for it to become involved. Another enormous misjudgment if you know how prevalent AIDS is in much of Africa. Only in 1986, 5 years after the first note on AIDS by the U.S. Center for Disease Control, did WHO seek funding to develop activities on AIDS. It took them 5 years. In WHO, though, it was, in 1987, however, it still had the established position. It was designated the lead agency in the fight against AIDS, and shortly thereafter, it established a global program on AIDS. So once again, being the established organization gives you a lot of ability, even if you're slow, to gain control of an activity. But its leadership role in addressing the AIDS epidemic led to an incomplete and ineffective policy response, partly because WHO focused on the purely medical rather than social aspects of the disease. It will not surprise any of you that AIDS is a social disease, and focusing only on the medical side is ineffective. WHO's medical approach was shaped by its organizational culture and extensive experience combating outbreaks of infectious disease. It was simply unable or unwilling to work collaboratively with other UN agencies to address the full impact of AIDS on societies. By the early 1990s, WHO's inability to effectively manage the global response to AIDS was apparent to donor countries, which began to shift resources away from WHO toward bilateral channels. So here, this is not counter-multilateralism. This is the classic move to unilateral or bilateral strategies if you don't like what the multilateral institutions are doing. The Global Program on AIDS tried to, within WHO, tried to address coordination problems with other agencies and proposed a yearly forum open to all stakeholders, but donor countries didn't think this idea went far enough. Sweden proposed the creation of a task force representing all key stakeholders, donor countries, developing countries, UN agencies, and civil society organizations to design a new body for coordinating the UN's efforts on AIDS, not to change WHO, but to define a new body. The task force proposed replacing the WHO's leadership role with a joint co-sponsored program. And despite resistance from UN agencies, particularly WHO for obvious reasons, UNAIDS became operational in January 1996. Many of WHO's AIDS-related activities were immediately shifted to the new organization. The shift in institutional authority was accompanied by a change in policy priorities. UNAIDS placed a heavy emphasis on building national capacity to respond to HIV/AIDS, and its staff began a political advocacy campaign to build national support for HIV/AIDS programs. That is, they viewed it as a social and not simply a medical problem. So viewed as a counter-multilateral challenge, UNAIDS emerged because of growing dissatisfaction with WHO and its narrow medical approach to AIDS, and the presence of organizational constraints which prevented WHO from successfully accommodating demands for change. The creation of UNAIDS has been described as, quote, a significant blow to the organization's leadership over a global health issue, unquote. But UNAIDS has not been entirely successful at gaining control over AIDS policy in the UN system. WHO took steps counter-multilateralism to reassert its role in global HIV/AIDS efforts, broadening its framework for AIDS response and launching a new initiative focused on the provision of antiretroviral drugs in low and middle income countries. So contestation continues. Now if I had more time, I could talk about energy. Germany played a major role in IRENA, the new, 3 years old now, I think, organization on renewable energy, which is a challenge to the International Energy Agency. So instead of trying to broaden the IEA's focus to include alternative energy, IRENA is set up as a separate organization funded in the Middle East with membership, it's pretty universal now, to promote alternative energy. There are lots of examples of regime shifting, much more familiar in the trade area with respect to intellectual property rights. But I want to come back up the level now and talk about what this all, in my view, means. Challenges to existing multilateral institutions may themselves be multilateral. We can't assume they're going to be simply unilateral challenges or bilateral ones, even though those still exist. States or coalitions of states, intergovernmental organizations, and non-state actors may support or create multilateral institutions with rules and practices that contradict those of established multilateral institutions to which they belong or with different missions. We study the phenomenon of counter-multilateralism because it seems to be a significant and quite novel process. And we didn't see it in 40 years ago, I think. And also to throw light on issues of institutional change. When interdependence is high and power is widely dispersed, multilateral institutions are essential tools for states and non-state actors. When coalitions are dissatisfied with existing institutions, they shift the focus they seek to shift the focus of rulemaking to other institutions or to construct new institutions for that purposes. States, intergovernmental organizations, and other non-state actors act strategically, using alternative multilateral organizations to pursue their interests when established institutions fail to do so. The result then is a change as in the ECJ case, the CADI case, as in the WHO cases, is a change in the configuration of multilateral institutions, often leading to a different pattern, whether a regime complex that's less integrated or some other new pattern. In the current era of economic and political power dispersion, driven by rapid economic growth in the former periphery, counter-multilateralism may become more common. Rich countries are likely to become more dissatisfied with established international organizations that respond as a result of consensus or one state, one vote decision rules to the preferences of developing countries. Increasingly powerful developing countries are likely to become dissatisfied with organizations such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund that are structured to be responsive to established donors. There's been talk, as you know, of a BRIC bank, of a Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa bank, which would be a classic example of counter-multilateralism. Most middle powers will only be able to change the international regime complex with broad-based coalitions through regime shifting. But those developing countries with significant resources may follow their developed counterparts, pursuing strategies of competitive regime creation, as in a BRIC development bank, to change the status quo. In the 21st century, counter-multilateralism may become the practice of choice to generate institutional change, as rival coalitions offer competing institutional visions for world politics. From a theoretical standpoint, what counter-multilateralism demonstrates is how embedded multilateralism is in contemporary world politics. It's no longer a secondary phenomenon. It's the warp and woof of world politics. So if you don't like what it's doing, you have to construct another multilateral organization often to oppose it. And this point can be driven home by discussing the Proliferation Security Initiative, or PSI. This is a post-9/11 initiative of the George W. Bush administration. This is not an initiative of fuzzy liberal institutionalists who read Bob Keohane's work. It was the leader of it was John W. Bolton, the man who walked into the office of an international organization head in 2002 and said, "You have 24 hours to leave your job or be fired." He didn't leave in 24 hours, and he was fired about 3 weeks later, after being in office for only 11 months of, I think, a 5-year term. So this is not a gentle, soft power kind of guy. And Bolton was a leader of the PSI. He, as you know, was ambassador to the UN at one point by the U.S., notorious in that role as well. But Bolton didn't organize a unilateral challenge to the law of the sea rules, which constrained searching and seizing vessels that might be carrying nuclear material. He didn't organize bilateral arrangements. You might have thought you have a whole set of bilateral coalition of the willing arrangements. No, Bolton organized a multilateral response, not legalized, not formalized, but the PSI now has over 100 member states, and it has a different set of practices than you might read from the law of the sea, a much more permissive set of practices for boarding ships that are suspected of carrying nuclear material. The PSI is an informal, non-legalized form of multilateralism. It's founded to challenge the rules of the formal multilateral regime, the law of the sea regime, which is virtually impossible to change, which the U.S. did not ratify anyway, governing the search and seizure that takes place on the high seas. If there's any tribute to multilateralism, it's the fact that John Bolton and the first George W. Bush administration engaged in a multilateral response when they didn't like the existing rules. World politics is changing. Multilateralism is itself becoming less coherent and less comprehensive. We can talk about that if you want to. Diffusion of power to formerly poor and weak countries and conflicts of interest ensure that issue areas are often governed by fragmented regime complexes rather than by coherent international regimes. Climate change is an obvious case in point, and trade and investment issues are moving in a similar direction. But these trends toward fragmentation and regime complexes do not mean a decline in the prevalence of multilateralism, only a change in form and perhaps effectiveness. Multilateralism is more embedded in the system than ever before. The best evidence for this proposition is that dissatisfaction with multilateralism typically leads now not to unilateralism or even to bilateralism, but to what I've called counter-multilateralism, a practice that we will see more and more often in future years. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your comments and criticism. Now we sit down with the discussants, and I shut up for a while.
Well, I would like, first of all, to... you are going to introduce me?
Okay, first of all, I have heard some requirements for additional coordination within the two of the Institute, and that is very
comparativist.
It is political science. I mean, if you counter international relations and democratic theory, that's probably the most intensive opposition that you can have, and therefore we consider it as an interdisciplinary contribution as well. Sonja, it's your turn.
Thank you. I would like to thank very much the organizers for giving me this opportunity to discuss Professor Keohane's work. I mean, it is really a privilege to be here and to discuss his work, and it's also a challenge. I mean, I am quite nervous, that's the truth. And, exit is not a viable option for me, so I'm stuck here. So I just wanted to say if what I say makes no sense, it's not because I'm usually a fool, it's just because I'm nervous. Okay, I'm not an IR person because otherwise I wouldn't be here. I work at the Department of Democracy and Democratization, but I'm mainly a comparativist. So as such, I am biased towards looking into what's going on inside states and to compare states rather than actually see how states interact in world politics. So it's kind of predictable, the kind of comments I'm going to make. I will raise 4 main points, 3 of which have to do with things that or issues that I think require further thinking maybe, or maybe further theorizing. And one last point, which is about one of the cases that is discussed that I found extremely interesting, the case about the European Court of Justice, that luckily was also discussed during the presentation. So my first point would be that the role of ideas and beliefs in this whole theory is kind of insinuated through the paper, but I don't know whether Professor Keohane wants to take it seriously or whether actually we should take it seriously at all, or whether just beliefs and ideas and ideologies are just excuses to hide hidden agendas maybe. But I will give 2 examples where in this path towards counter-multilateralism, we come across this problem. The first is the existence of a viable outside option. And my question would be, is there an objective measure of what is a viable outside option? Or is it instead we're talking about the ideas, beliefs of the actors involved about what are the alternatives that they have ahead of them? And I am going to use an example that I don't know whether I'm stretching your concept too much, but it's something that is in my head for almost years now. And the question would be, what would your theory say about the option of an exit from the Eurozone? The idea would be, is Euro, according to your theory, a viable exit option? Or would you look into whether it is a viable exit option for the actors? And in this sense, one could say, debtor countries from Southern Europe are convinced that it is not an option, that there's no alternative to austerity, and that the option would be close to suicide. But many analysts, among them myself, we think that this is a case for counter-multilateral action, for a challenge, that Southern European countries get together, establish a coalition that is obviously highly dissatisfied, and that threaten with exit unless austerity is abandoned. So what would be the truth here? Does it have to do with beliefs, or is it just a question of, oh, they have a hidden agenda because some multinational corporation is paying the checks of the parties in government or something like that? Now, the second example of where ideas and beliefs may be relevant is the question of credibility and information asymmetries. So the credibility given to a threat of exit depends very much, according to your paper, on the availability of information and whether there are asymmetries of information or not. And I believe that, in a way, beliefs have to be taken into account in the sense that actors may have all the available information and yet discard it due to previous beliefs, or they may process this information in a way that is very determined by their beliefs. And I will go back again to my example of the Euro exit option. So let us imagine that there is actually, this coalition is established of Southern European governments that threat with exit unless austerity is abandoned. Now, let us imagine that another coalition of member states of the European Council, led by Germany, are so convinced that there is no alternative to austerity that they think that countries would be fooled to leave the euro. And therefore, they take this threat as a bluff. But they don't take the threat as a bluff because there are asymmetries of information, because we're talking about democracies with transparent processes. The social costs of austerity in Southern Europe are for all to see. The fact that they have increasingly angry populations is for all to see. The effects that this is having on the collapse of mainstream parties is also for all to see. So I think that in this case, the credibility of the threat would not be determined by an asymmetry of information, but by the beliefs of the actors involved, in the sense that we don't believe you, we think it's a bluff, but because we are so convinced that we are right. Now, the second point I would like to make about an issue that I think requires further thinking maybe is the role of regime types. And here comes the comparativist in me. Democracies versus non-democracies. Now, democracies have an advantage which is transparency. So because everybody knows the kind of domestic constraints they're facing, it is more likely that they are going to make credible threats, as opposed maybe to non-democracies, or maybe to institutions that are more hidden in their processes, internal processes, etc. However, democracies have also a disadvantage. The disadvantage would be that the definition of a state interest, and in other words, the degree of dissatisfaction with the status quo, might be contingent on the color of the government or on the mood of domestic constituencies. And if this happens, I mean, we could think of different governments in Southern European countries right now. We could think of Beppe Grillo in Italy, Syriza in Greece, Indignados in Spain being in government. They probably would look at Euro exit in different terms. So this poses a difficulty for an unsatisfied coalition of democracies that wants to engage in counter-multilateral action, because the problem would be how to hold out long enough with the same definition of state interests to make this unsatisfied coalition succeed. So I think there may be an interaction of regime type and time, or timing, that maybe could be more explicitly hypothesized. Now, the third point is about the state power, which I think is very relevant for the theory, and which I think is everywhere and nowhere. And there are, in a way, I see two interpretations of power in the paper. One would be power as an internal attribute of states. So there are weak states and strong states, although this is not defined in the paper. And then there is power as an external attribute that is provided by a particular institutional framework. And this mainly concerns decision rules. So if you have decision-making by unanimity, this means that even weak states have power because they can veto decisions. However, it could also be the case that this power that is given externally by institutions is then taken away by the mere or the brute power relations between states, because the strong state may put such pressure on the weak state as to force the weak state into voting whatever the strong state wants it to vote. So the question would be, how do these different types of power interact to increase or not counter-multilateral challenges? On the other hand, how does counter-multilateralism contribute to increase or decrease the internal power of states? And finally, what are the resources that make a coalition of unsatisfied actors powerful? Is the power of a coalition only the result of the sum of power of the constituent actors, or does it go beyond it for the mere fact of being a coalition? And finally, my comment is on the case of the European Court of Justice. That is an institution-led regime shifting. I find this example very interesting, but also in a way, it seems to me to be exceptional in various ways with respect to the definition that you make at the beginning, the 4-point definition of what accounts as multiculturalism. I'm going to say CM from now on. All right, so why is it in a way exceptional? First of all, the initiator is not a coalition of actors, either states or non-states, it's an individual. Because you need at least, courts can only judge if called upon to do so. So you need at least one unsatisfied individual to initiate and trigger the whole process. Second, the challenger, which is the European Court of Justice, is not the initiator. It's the challenger, but somebody initiates it first. Third, the challenger, the European Court of Justice, is not a coalition of actors, but it's just one institutional actor. And this is no problem. You say yourself in the paper that this may happen exceptionally, but the problem is that counter-multilateralism is said to be intrinsically on coalition building, but here there's no coalition building at all. There's no need for coalition building. And finally, the challenger, the European Court of Justice, is outside the status quo of the status quo institution, the institution that is being challenged, which means that exit is not really an option in such a situation. The options are either voice, or exit is only indirectly an option by forcing member states of the status quo coalition to exit. But it's not an available, direct available option. So my question would be, and this is the final one, how do these exceptions fit into the definition of the 4-point definition you make of counter-multilateralism as a phenomenon? Thank you very much.
And our second discussant is Stefan Hook, also from the WZB.
Economists like slides, otherwise they feel insecure. And economists like models for the same reason. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity here. So I interpreted my task as, looking through the economics literature, if you like, through the toolbox of our theories and models, to see whether, we can add anything or have anything, useful to say about this. So what we have seen is that counter-multilateralism is a recent but pervasive phenomenon in international policy, and we have seen, that the precise forms vary, and so do the pathways. And the question that you raised towards the end of your paper is, can we say more about the conditions? Can we make some more general statements about the conditions under which it's a difficult word, CM arises? So I've been turning to cooperative game theory, which is sort of the part of the literature that looks at formation of coalitions and their stability. And basically I want to, just point you to one rather arcane result from the late 1970s that seemed to have, some appeal in this context. So just a little bit about cooperative game theory before, we turn to this result. So cooperative game theory assumes that cooperation within coalitions is not an issue, it's possible, and then asks the questions which coalitions will form and which outcomes will be generated. And one of the key solution concepts in that literature is the concept of the core. So what is the core? The core contains all outcomes that the grand coalition, so the coalition of all players, can implement that cannot be blocked by any coalitions. We have been talking about that coalitions might block certain outcomes, that might be 1 or 2 players or any number of them. So an outcome is in the core, if it's an outcome where no combination of coalitions would break away. Now, so this is an attractive property because, obviously it appeals to, it has a certain amount of stability. But sadly, for theorists, the core may be non-empty. Maybe empty. Sometimes it's a solution concept that sometimes might not have bite. Now, in the context of today's topic, this might be interesting because, if we think about a changing world in a situation where, we have we have an element in the core, so an outcome, that would not be blocked by any coalition, but then conditions change to a situation where the core becomes empty, then we would predict breakaway, and we would predict, breakaway of coalitions. So there's a famous theorem, so that's not the arcane one, there's a famous theorem from the 1960s that has been sort of discovered independently by Olga Bondareva and Lord Shapley. Lord Shapley got the Nobel Prize last year in economics. And that links, emptiness or non-emptiness of the core to a property of games that is called balancedness, and we don't have the time to talk about that. It's a rather technical concept. But the interesting thing is you can just apply it, and then look what it implies for your application. If you look at this, for just 3-player constellations, you find that the sum of the values of all 2-player coalitions must not exceed twice the value of the grand coalition of all players. So what you see is already here in the simple example that the threat indeed doesn't come from a unilateral deviation. The threat comes always from a multilateral deviation. And basically, if you look at this little formula, you see if there are many, sort of high-value multilateral threats, then you might get instability, right? So it's not just one, it's many multilateral threats, you might get instability. Now, the result that I wanted to turn to that, I think has, might have an interesting story in the context of what we heard tonight is related to the Nakamura number. Now, I asked some colleagues over the last, week or so, and I found one person who had heard about this before. So this is a result that applies to so-called simple games. So what are simple games? Simple games is where coalitions either win and then implement what they want, or they lose. Okay, so many voting games are simple games, right? Either you win the vote or you don't. And you can describe simple games simply by listing the set of all coalitions that can win. Yeah? So if you think about a situation where there are 5 players and there's majority voting, we can describe this game as just listing all the coalitions that can force the win, right? 1, 2, and 3 together, they would have a majority. 1, 2, and 4 would have a majority. But of course also 1, 3, 4, and 5, and all of them together, right? So we can write down this list. Now, what is the Nakamura number? The Nakamura number is the minimal number of winning coalitions that you have to write down to get an empty intersection. Okay, now you might say, great, yeah, of course I can define that number, but why should I? Yeah, so I'm going to show you the theorem in a minute, and it shows that the number is actually quite interesting. So just going back to our majority voting with 5 players, if you do this, you find that the Nakamura number for this case is 3. Yeah, just take the example 1, we have the set 1, 2, and 3, intersected with 1, 4, and 5. Only the 1 survives, is in this intersection. Now we intersect with 2, 3, and 4, and the intersection is empty. Okay? So the Nakamura number for this is 3. Now we come to his theorem, 1979, and that says the following, that the core of a simple game is guaranteed to be non-empty as long as the number of alternatives, that is discussed, is strictly smaller than the Nakamura number. So in other words, for our example of majority voting with 5 players, we can only guarantee that the core is non-empty if there are no more than 2 alternatives that are discussed. The moment there are more than 2 alternatives, it might be that the grand coalition can't form because, there will be a multilateral response to it. Some coalition would break away. Now, why is this why do I find this potentially interesting? Well, if you think about an increasingly more globalized world, certain states becoming more powerful and having a voice, then, it seems to be a natural consequence that the number of options that is debated, the number of alternatives, is ever increasing. At the same time, if you look at the constitutional rules of multilateral institutions, they seem to be fairly inert. Maybe by definition, because they're constitutional rules. But this creates a process where, over time, the Nakamura condition will be more and more often violated, right? So the space of viable policy option gets larger, the voting rule stays constant, yeah? The Nakamura condition will be more often violated. Now, if you think about what kind of constitutional change would be required in order to keep the grand coalitions intact and stable, then if you look at the definition of the Nakamura number, it becomes quite intuitive that one possibility is to impose to require supermajorities for decision making, or to have sort of asymmetric voting rights. Where some players become stronger and more important in the decision-making process than others. That's what I wanted to say. It's just a little result. I thought that when I was looking at this, that it's a nice story. Potentially you can look at it empirically. Does it happen? When the space of options becomes fairly large, you can take this to empirics, I guess.
Very different comments. I'm going to start with the second one. There was a time when I was very enamored of applying game theory to international relations, although mostly non-cooperative game theory. I don't think that it's going to work very well in this case. It's an interesting perspective, but I don't think we've ever had a situation where there were few alternatives. The world politics is so relatively unstructured that there have always been many alternatives to existing rules. I think the Nakamura number has probably always been exceeded and violated. If you had supermajorities required, that could generate more counter-multilateralism, because it would mean that it was more likely that even a majority might be dissatisfied with the existing non-action of the institution. So it seems to me that I doubt, it's always interesting, and I'm indebted to you, because it's always interesting to look at world politics through a different perspective. But I think the core in general is empty in international relations. It's clearly empty in the United States, by the way. If it were possible to be more empty than empty, it would be that way. So I doubt I think one always has the possibility of instability. One thing that's not involved in cooperative game theory, the way you put it, is the use of coercion. I think that is another element. It's also the case, I think there's always a very large number of actors, so these games become quite difficult to manage with more than 3 or 4 actors, and when you have a large number of actors, they become trickier. So I see game theory as a very useful heuristic, and I'm indebted to you for raising it, because it's a different way of looking at problems. I have become disillusioned. There was a period when I thought, the solution to all our problems of understanding cooperation is going to lie with game theory. I can date that to about 3 months in 1985 after I had written After Jones. Here's the answer, and I don't think it's worked out that way. In general, the folk theorem applies that there are a very large number, an infinite number of possible game theoretic solutions to problems which are typically non-cooperative, and therefore, because they can't be enforced by any centralized authority, and therefore it's very difficult to. It's useful from the point of view of insights, difficult from the point of view, or not so useful from the point of view of solutions, in my view. Sonia Alonso's points are very different and very interesting, and quite a variety. The first real question was, what's the role of ideas and beliefs? And there's no reason you should know this, but I did write and edit a book on the role of ideas in international politics 20 years ago, so I wouldn't at all dismiss them. I think that viable outside options are socially constructed under constraints. And sometimes the constraints are very severe. So when a country is attacked by a powerful state, you could say they socially constructed the threat, but there's not much social construction there. It's mostly direct threat. When it's not directly attacked and there's lots of margin for choice, then the interests are more socially constructed. So I think that varies in different situations. Now, so the question then is, what about an option for an exit from the Eurozone? I think the question is whether anybody would believe that the coalition of Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal would be credible. I wouldn't believe it. So I think so if you could imagine a situation where we all believed that they would credibly threaten to leave the Eurozone, and if we didn't like that result in Germany, then you could imagine this being a problem. That seems to me we're not very close to where we actually are. So I think that Germany would see the exit threat as a bluff, and I think they would see it correctly as a bluff. But certainly the general point is right. It's a matter of there is a social construction of this, but it is social construction under constraints, and sometimes those constraints are observable to both or all parties in the situation. Now, your second issue was about democracies versus non-democracies. And this is you're basically raising a classic cooperation problem. How do you organize cooperation among democracies when they may have different views? But we know that, in fact, cooperation is much more prevalent among democracies than among non-democracies, for the reason that you give, that is, they're more credible. They can more credibly promise to each other. So this is just a classic cooperation problem. It's a standard cooperation problem. If dissatisfaction by a number of states is not a sufficient condition for counter-multilateralism, you also have to have sufficient confidence in your other dissatisfied partners that they would actually stick with you in some measure in constructing the counter-multilateral alternative. I have trouble pronouncing many words. Somehow I have an easy time with counter-multilateralism. It trips off the tongue. The third question you had was the question of state power. I use a fairly standard relational definition of power. I consider power to be the ability to affect outcomes in desired ways through the use of resources which need not be material. They can be material, they can be ideational, they can be institutional. So the fact, if one likes the status quo, the fact that an institution requires a unanimous vote or one has a veto is an institutional resource. If one doesn't like the status quo, the fact that somebody else has an institutional veto is negative for power. So in that sense, I would just I'm pretty standard on the use of power. It seems to me that that's how I was using it in the paper implicitly. And finally, the Kadi case, yes, the Kadi case is an exception, but George Bundy once said about Vietnam, infamously, that crises are like streetcars that come along all the time. Individuals who will protest institutional rules are like streetcars. They'll come along all the time. That's not a variable. Kadi isn't very important here. If Kadi didn't exist, somebody else would have challenged those rules. So what's really important is what you called the challenger, not the initiator. That there was an institution that was willing to put its institutional weight on the line to challenge another institution, and furthermore, that the European Union supported the ECJ. You could have imagined a situation where the EU says, "Oh, we don't like where this court's going. We're not going to back it." But they felt constrained to support the ECJ, and that was partly also socially constrained. So I think that each of these situations will be in some measure exceptional. WHO is a case of gross mismanagement of an international organization by the leadership of WHO in the 1980s and 90s. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had this counter-multilateralism. If they'd been halfway competent, they wouldn't have had it because they had all the cards in their hands. The case of ARENA, the energy agency, is a case of a influential German politician who had decided his mission in life was to create a renewable energy agency, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer, and he built a coalition in Europe for it. So the particulars of each case will be specific, but I think the phenomenon is general because we have this general condition that we have lots of issues managed by multilateral institutions in a way that others are dissatisfied with, and the opportunities of creating, competing, or using different multilateral institutions are available given the thickness of institutional structure and, of course, the social expectation, which you point to, that multilateralism is an appropriate way to respond. So when I said earlier in the talk that one reason to pursue multilateralism is that bilateralism backfires, of course it backfires because of social views. If people thought it was acceptable for great power simply to say, well, we don't like it, we're going to follow a unilateral or bilateral policy, then you wouldn't have as much counter-multilateralism. But insofar as there's that social understanding that it's not a good idea to act unilaterally, then the John Boltons of the world and the George W. Bushes say, well, let's set up a multilateral organization to achieve our purposes and not at least defy this convention. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, we have almost 30 minutes left. This is.
You sound surprised.
This is very good for EZB standards. So thank you to the three of you for keeping the time. You have now the possibility to ask questions. We agreed that we do it on a one-to-one basis. There will be mics, and the first mic goes to this gentleman here to the left.
Hi, I have a couple of questions, please pick, I don't want to monopolize. So my first point would be what you just said in the end, just trying to connect with the big picture aside from the case studies. I understood, of course, you're using relatively specific regimes, specific cases, but if you add this up, I mean, first the question is that, do I understand you right, that the proliferation of counter-multilateralism you're seeing is primarily and first and foremost the result of the sheer density of existing multilateralism, or is it also something that could be related to things like, the end of, unipolar world, the change of power, and so on and so forth? So is that what is the balance there? And the other connection there is, if you're talking about institutions, you're in your work obviously talking about formal organizations, but how would you connect it, or would you want to connect it to a different understanding of institutions as in the English school, saying, do you see some new forms of core institutions emerged or being challenged in that form? And finally, if you use your framework, do you see a parallel to the analysis, the classic public policy analysis in US politics? I mean, a lot of what you could call, what came to my mind, hey, why not use an advocacy coalition approach or things like that? I mean, all that kind of stuff that's been used in US public policy analysis, is that a valid kind of parallel?
Let me respond to the first two. I'm not sure I have anything to say about the third. In my view, counter-multilateralism results from a combination of density and shifts in interest and power. And we're seeing, we both have a very dense system, and we have rapid shifts in interest and power. So those are the conditions. If we only had a dense system and there were no changes in interest and power, you wouldn't expect to see any counter-multilateralism. So it has to, and if you had a sparse system with very few multilateral institutions, you wouldn't see it very often. So it's the combination of these two, in my view, which is generating it. I was speaking about specific, what I call in the past, specific as opposed to general institutions. A specific institution is an organization or a set of rules which refer to a given issue area. So WHO is a specific institution, so are the TRIPS rules. A general institution in the English school sense is diplomacy or the state system, and I'm not talking about that. And it would be hard to put this. So I'm talking strategically, and that is a long-term ideational shift they're talking about. I don't think that fits very closely with it. Now, one thing, Mikael, I want to make sure we do, and talk about ground rules here. You mentioned that I have lots of women students. It's true. I don't want to hear all questions from men. I want to see some hands of women up, and I want to try to recognize a rough balance if you can.
That's right.
There we go.
I mean, Dorothea is on the list. We move now to the middle, and then we go back to the left. So, Herr Hoffmann. The mic is coming.
Sorry, the female part I cannot play, but in any way. Many thanks, Michael Hofmann is my name, to your lecture. Wonderful, helping me a little bit out of the frustration as someone who's a great fan of multilateralism. To see in all of this inertia that we see in many cases, be it in environmental issues and so on, that you see in all of this a positive movement forward in any way. So in that sense, I assume you would also regard the G20 as a counter-institutional or counter-multilateralism with regard to the inertia in the Security Council and so on. But on the, I would like to challenge you only a little bit on this health issue, because I was a little bit involved in some of that. My memory is that whenever big money is involved, you have a shift towards those institutions that are classically financial institutions. So since suddenly in the US there was a tremendous propensity to give big money on health issues, vaccination and so on, big money, there was a classic reaction from the Treasury in the US to say, this is certainly not money for UN institutions because they don't know how to handle money. So there was this kind of shift towards the World Bank, at least for due diligence reasons in all of that. And I must say, my German government and others, we were erecting in the same way, because in a certain way, take our Ministry of Finance here, these guys all know the World Bank, they know the IMF. What they don't know how these health people work. And they doubt that these health people really know how to handle big money. So I would say it has more to do with that. And you see this in many cases. You have the same case in the environmental issue. Since there is not a willingness to create a truly UN institution on environmental issues, which has a fund-type money base, you see that more and more functions that would be necessary in that field, they are rather in the World Bank, with special trust funds here, special trust funds there. So my question is it not the aspect of money that plays a big role, and the propensity of those with money to rather relate to the financial institutions, be it the US Treasury, be it the Gates and the others with the big money? Thank you.
It's certainly true, and I teach it in my international organization courses, that money goes to institutions that are controlled by the rich. That is, wealthy states don't put a lot of money in the hands of organizations that they don't control. It's not surprising, it's not rocket science. So if you look at development organizations, the UNDP has a derisory amount of money. There's something called UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Fund, but has no industry, no development, no fund. And the World Bank gets the funding. But that's not the count. That, to me, that's a different issue. So so that's a general phenomenon, and you find that at the outset. So where, at least in the WHO case, WHO had control of these areas, and it simply squandered it because it was frankly so incompetent under its Japanese Director General that even its natural allies in the NGO community, NGO health community, who should have been its natural allies, deserted it. So I think your general point is right, but I don't think it's the story of this WHO counter-multilateralism.
I mean, if I look to my list, I would have problems to
That's why
fulfill.
I want you to go to the women on your list next. Skip the man.
to fulfill this this 50-50 quota on the gender side. I can do it possibly on the left-right side. So, but let's stay on the right side for the moment. OOTR is the next.
During your talk, you mentioned several times that multilateralism is so established, and I couldn't find any argument for why this is so. Maybe you said it and I missed it, then I apologize. But now in Steffen's discussion, we saw that there's one strategic reason. The Bondarev-Shapley theorem shows you that if you want to challenge a coalition, it's better to be in a coalition as well. It's much easier. So it's a strategic reason to do that, if I understand this correctly. Now, in your response to Sonia Alonso, you said something else. You said it's because of social views that you cannot unilaterally go ahead and oppose an existing institution. Now, I wonder, what's the empirics of it? How do you test which of the views is correct? I mean, these are two plausible explanations, and I don't know, in the case of Gavi, for example, is it simply for societal acceptance that they were trying to form a big coalition, or is it because they, like this, they were able to acquire more money from more international pharmaceutical companies? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question, and I'm just wondering how you resolve these questions, how you form your views.
I'm going to back up and talk about my theory of institutions, which I didn't talk about, but it's 30 years old. So I think that multilateral institutions are, on the whole, explained by the functions they perform, that there are many tasks which can not be achieved by individual states, and setting up ad hoc coalitions is very costly, has high transaction costs. It's a transactions cost theory. The transaction costs involve also high information costs. Expectations aren't easily structured. And so it's much more effective and much more efficient to set up international institutions, set up established ones with known rules, and all of these institutions, to an approximation, provide information. They don't all coerce anybody, but they all, I think, all provide information of some sort and stabilize expectations in some way. So I think it's not surprising that so in a situation where there's a high degree of interdependence, meaning that state purposes cannot be accomplished without cooperative action. It turns out that cooperative action is immensely facilitated by multilateral institutions. If the states don't seek cooperative action, if their interests diverge strikingly, sharply, then you don't get multilateral institutions. They're instrumental to the purpose of cooperation. Cooperation is instrumental to achieving objectives that can't be achieved otherwise. That's what I think is fundamentally going on. Then within that context, states always act strategically. I mean, do an approximation. So you would calculate not only what your best outcome is, but what the probability of achieving the outcome in various ways is. And if there's a dominant multilateral institution which controls a lot of the rules in the issue area, your first step is going to probably see how you can influence the outcomes in that institution, because the costs of going outside it are going to be high. So counter-multilateralism then is a last resort, because first you'd rather change the institutional practices. Only when both you feel that you can't achieve that, and secondly, you think you have an outside option, meaning you have a coalition of dissatisfied actors have sufficient power resources to achieve something on their own, does it make sense to go outside it? So I think that the common understandings, my view is that the role of ideas is sometimes important, but it's secondary to the role of interests and power and the kind of functions that the states desire to have performed by the institutions.
Benjamin.
Thanks. I have two questions. The first one is, can we expect that states and institutions accept interinstitutional conflict as a result of counter-multilateralism, or can we expect that they try to counter this effect of counter-multilateralism? It seems to me quite clear that the result of counter-multilateralism is a loss of cooperative gains. So it means that joint gains should be available if states or institutions would again coordinate the conflicting institutions. So we might assume that there is at least a collective interest in some sort of coordinating or of having a coordinative meta-governance. And we might also assume that states and institutions, if we ascribe a certain degree of agency to them, have that interest. So my question is counter-multilateralism really the end of the story, or is it only the first part of the story? And my second point is on the relationship between efficiency considerations and distributive considerations. If I understood your argument correctly, the distributive part is decisive here. So states are willing to accept reduced efficiency of multilateral institutions to advance distributional gains, or to gain distributionally. And I would like to ask, is that correct? And if so, how does that relate to your earlier work, where, if I understand correctly, you emphasize efficiency gains of international institutions and that they are more important than distributive considerations? Is that to a certain degree a contradiction, an evolution, or am I just wrong?
Those are very, very good questions. Thank you. I'm going to take the second one up first. If you go back and read after Gemini, you'll see, I think it's on page 124, a clear statement of the importance of distributional gains. Certain intellectual opponents who couldn't win arguments distorted my views, and you should read the work and not the characterization of what the views were. So because I never denied the importance of distributional gains. It always was clear in my argument that if there are very serious distributional gains, you're not going to get cooperative institutions because you don't have a joint gain that's perceived as a joint gain. So the distributive issues are important. They're always important in world politics, and I've always seen them as important in world politics. The problem there is that certain forms of realism claimed that distributional gains were so important that you'd never get cooperation. Remember, John Mearsheimer said and wrote in 1990 that the end of the Cold War meant that Europe would go back to the future. We'd go back to a balance of power system because you couldn't have cooperation. You know, it wasn't a very good prediction, but at least he was honest enough to make it forthrightly. That stereotypical view, which exaggerated the dominance of distributional interests, when those advocates of that view found themselves on the defensive because they couldn't explain cooperation that was extensive, they claimed that their intellectual opponents like me didn't understand distributional issues. But in fact, we always built them in. They just exaggerated them to the point at which they thought there was no space for cooperation. It was manifestly false. It became manifestly false. Now, on the other point, I went over this quickly, and this is my game theoretical thinking. I tend to think not in cooperative, but in non-cooperative game theoretical terms. And I went over it quickly, so I'll talk about it. The argument I was making, implying was exactly yours. If you really think about this in equilibrium, you shouldn't observe much counter-multilateralism. Because if the outside coalition has a viable outside option, that should be common knowledge observed by the established institution. It should not only be concerned about efficiency gains, it ought to be concerned about its own authority. And the last thing it should want is a counter-multilateral coalition, which, for example, wiped out any kind of influence of the WHO Secretary General, who did all these silly things. So you might expect in a full information, perfectly rational equilibrium with no organizational constraints that you never observe this. That it could be important because the potential threat of forming this coalition could be the explanation for changes in the existing institutions' policies, but you never observe it. Now, we do observe it. And so I try to say give a few suggestions about why I think we do, although I didn't prove them. One is organizational constraints. You might have subunits of your organization, it may have been true with WHO, that are so committed to a certain point of view they can't adapt. Another might be informational. It might be that the leadership doesn't understand the magnitude of the challenge. Or it might be distributional, that there are such strong differences of interest that actually there isn't a joint gain there, and they're holding on to their view because they can't see a better alternative that they could get agreement to on the other side. But the question is very well taken. One always has to ask, and if we theorize this very precisely, we have to find out in each case why you had counter-multilateralism. It's a puzzle that it emerges in the first place.
Heike Hamgard here in the first row.
Thank you very much. I have a practitioner's question, since I think I'm the only one here actually working for a successful counter-multilateral organization that has been successful for the last 25 years. So I'm actually wondering, what are the conditions that make these institutions successful, or in what make them more pervasive, or would, from your prediction, would make them sort of more frequent? So I think, okay, so the institution I'm working for is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and one of the reasons was the interactions with institutions that are not part of the status quo that sort of made, I think, its success. So in this case, with the private sector, and I think that was also partially what you mentioned for Gavi, that it was actually the new counter-multilateral institutions managed maybe to interact with actors that are not part of the status quo interaction more, maybe even efficiently. So I was wondering, would that be potentially part of the conditions that would make it more frequent, or at least counter-multilateral institutions more successful in the future? Or is it only about density and the arguments that you mentioned before?
It's a great question. In fact, it's here's a practitioner asking the most theoretical question that's been asked so far. And that is, under what conditions do you get counter-multilateralism? But first, let me ask you a question. Why do you consider the EBRD counter-multilateral? What institutions do you see it as countering?
I think the mandate could have been easily taken over by the World Bank Group, so a combination of the World Bank and the International Financial Corporation, and basically all the policies, products, and that EBRD offers is in the menu of the World Bank Group. So they could have just done it, but I think at the time it was, of course, Mitterrand and Kohl who didn't want to have a US-led institution. I mean, they wanted a new institution. So it was a multilateral challenge of an existing so I thought it would fit actually quite well into your theory.
It's a great example, so I'll think about it more. I thought about the EBRD, but in a different context 15 years ago. I haven't, so thank you for that. The conditions that make, here's my suggestion about this, and since this is a new paper, I don't claim to have established these conditions, but I did talk about them a little bit, so I'm going to review that again. One condition that, in the first place, there have to be existing institutions, in this case the World Bank. There has to be some set of actors that are dissatisfied with them. And in this case, in your story, it's the British and the French, at least, who are, if not totally dissatisfied, they aren't trying to replace the World Bank. They just really don't want the World Bank operating in their backyard, being dominant in their backyard. They'd rather have their own sandbox, their own organization in their backyard. I think that's the basic story. And they have to, and then those actors have to have sufficient resources that they can establish an outside option. So that's exactly what happened here. It wasn't Belgium and Liechtenstein setting up the EBRD. They might have been for it. I have no idea, but they couldn't have put it forward. So I think it fits the conditions that I was specifying pretty closely. So that would be my expectation.
Martin Binder. The guy here, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for it is very interesting talk, and I have a lot of questions. I think I should limit myself to 3 very brief points. And the first is not so much a question, but more a concern about the concept of county multilateralism, because I had the same concern or similar concerns than Sonia Alonso about the role of international organizations that are the challengers of the status quo. But I think there's a different concern that I have, and this is basically because I think your argument involves 2 different variants. One is that a coalition of states is dissatisfied with the status quo and then turns to alternative institutions or shifts to existing regimes in order to challenge the existing institution and to induce change in the existing institution. The second variant of the argument would be that the dissatisfied coalitions of states turns to a new institution or shifts to a different institution, and that fits their interest better, and then they stick to this institution, and they forget about the old institutions. And you have mentioned the TRIPS example, and I think this is an example where exactly that happened. So the intellectual property shifted from WIPO to the WTO, and now states act through this institution. So my question is, what exactly is then the county multilateralism argument? Very briefly, a second question is, you have talked about dissatisfaction with the status quo, but you have not actually explained why states are dissatisfied with the
No, I'm not trying to explain that.
Okay,
that happens for many reasons.
Okay.
It's a condition of the theory. It's not part of the theory.
Okay, so it's but
no, it's a very important distinction. Every theory has a set of conditions that are assumptions. Under these conditions, the theory applies. If it doesn't apply, if those conditions don't exist, the theory is not relevant. It's not right or wrong. It's not relevant. That's very distinct from a set of propositions in a theory, which can be right or wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but it might be that actually states are dissatisfied also for legitimacy concerns, and this might have an impact for the institutional design of the new institution. Last question, is county multilateralism an option only for strong states? Because I think the necessary resources are necessary to create a new institution. Only strong states have outside options. And if so, how do weak states actually mount counter multilateralism?
So I'll take up the first question and the third. The first one was about the difference between using regimes to challenge another institution and using regimes to replace it. The counter-multilateralism move is the first move. This is a strategic game. This is not some sort of architectonic decision process. So the counter-multilateralism, counter-multilateral coalition challenges the institution. You don't know whether it's going to replace. There are several options. First, it could fail. I'll get to that in a minute. I didn't assume that it was going to succeed. It could simply fail. The institution could brush it off, successfully wipe it aside. The second possibility is that the institution, but the next question is, the key question is, what's the established institution's move? Its move could be to brush it aside, successfully or not, or its move could be to adapt to development. So if you start a counter-multilateral coalition, I observe that you have that whole side of the room and the whole back of the room in your favor. All I have is the first 3 rows in mine. I'm going to adapt pretty fast, right? And what you're going to observe is a changed institution. You're not going to observe that you'll never set up a new institution, because I'll react so fast that you'll achieve your objectives that way. So you can only answer that question not by the actions of the counter-multilateral coalition, but by the outcome of the strategic game, which involves the established institutions and its supporters also. Is counter-multilateralism an option only for strong state? No. There's a lot of examples of it. They're very weak, but the new international economic order of the 1970s is an example, actually, of counter-multilateralism. The UN, the dominant development organizations were the World Bank and the IMF. The UN majority didn't like them. Tried to pass resolutions for a new international economic order. The dominant institutions were pro-capitalist and pro-liberal trade. They tried to set up institutions that were different. The dominant institutions were in favor of freedom of speech and expression, and the new World Information Order was designed to counter that. They all failed. They all failed flat, although for a while some people took them seriously, but they were attempted by weak states. Now, whether weak states can succeed at counter-multilateralism is like the whole question of when weak states succeed at anything, and the answer is only when they can get a very large number of weak states who agree with their policy and are willing to stick with it and not be peeled off by appeals from powerful states. And that only happens rarely. It's in principle possible, but only happens rarely.
We have 2 more, and if you don't mind, we take those 2 together. So the first one would be Andrea Liese here on the right side, and then Ruud Koopmans.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have a comment and a question. The comment refers to the discussion about the role of beliefs.
The role of what?
The role of beliefs that we had before, also in the comment by Sonia Alonso. And I was wondering, again, sorry for referring to the CVI Gavi example, I guess that's the one some of us know best here. I'm wondering whether the norm that international organizations should cooperate, which has become pretty prominent in the UN agency context in the 1990s, and in addition, a norm to cooperate with the private sector and non-state actors in general, which also several scholars argue has emerged in the 90s, plays a role here, in particular when Brundtland enters and adopts some changes to the WHO, sorry, which her former the former Director General didn't do. And you have referred yourself to organizational culture. And I have read some stories about the CVI case as well, that the Secretariat of the WHO office was indeed trying to dominate CVI to a very high extent because it also believed it's the only legitimate organization and shouldn't cooperate with others. So I think here beliefs could actually play a role. I'm just interested in your idea as to this case. That was the comment. The question is, I'm very sympathetic with the general picture. I still also wonder in how far certain conceptual clarifications could help us to dig a bit deeper as to some conditions of the well, I'm losing it too, the counter-multilateralism. And I have two ideas. On the one hand, I was wondering whether it wouldn't make sense to distinguish a bit more between institutions as formal norms and rules, such as in the regime definition, and as organizations, and related, whether it wouldn't make sense to distinguish a bit in the policy cycle whether these the counter-multilateralism is addressing policy implementation and dispute settlement on the one hand, or policy formulation and rule generation on the other. That might stick to questions of effectiveness and legitimacy, and the question as to when states are dissatisfied with the outcomes of international rules. It could also mean that formal institutions often engage in implementation, while regimes are those where states generate rules in the first place, and so on. And I also ask this because I have worked a lot with organizational theories, and what you have actually addressed reminds me of the whole debate of pathologies of international organizations as formal institutions, of those organizations that are highly bureaucratized, where you have principal agency problems you could speak of organizational culture problems, you could speak of stickiness, you could speak of decoupling, and so on. This is it. I just wonder whether this distinction of organizations and regimes could make sense. Sorry for being so long.
Ruud. This is Ruud Koopmans here. So.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you made a very convincing case that counter-multilateralism is on the rise, and I wanted to ask you where you think it is taking us, because both you and Michael Zürn emphasized that sort of the international system shifted from a state of anarchy to one where, you know, global multilateral institutions set rules in many areas. And the question now is, what does counter-multilateralism do to this global governance system? Does it strengthen it in the sense that it creates an intricate web of checks and balances, which is altogether more coherent and more integrated, and altogether shifts away power more from states to global governance institutions? Or is it something that undermines gains that have been made in global governance, and does it lead the world in the direction of, say, the way in which global boxing is organized, namely many competing organizations that all claim to determine who is the world champion, but altogether one would not call boxing, even though it has the largest number of international organizations, the most cohesive and most integrated world sport? And if there's no general yes or no answer, under which conditions can we expect development in the direction of integration, or one in the direction of disintegration?
Okay, first just a comment. It'd be ironic if boxing were a very competitive arrangement, wouldn't it? A very cooperative arrangement. So it had a lot of cooperation. Sorry. First on your questions about beliefs. There is now the norm, or there is at least a nominal norm, that UN agencies should cooperate with each other and that they should be open to initiatives. But that norm came from somewhere. It wasn't prominent in the 1980s. So I would hesitate to attribute causality to it for the WHO. It may be that the failure of was it Nakajima administration in WHO, and because of the attacks for exactly not being open and not being cooperative, that helped to generate that norm, and that their failure to maintain their dominance was an object lesson to other leaders of organizations. So it's always difficult to know whether a norm has causal impact. And obviously it does sometimes. And in this case, it sounds to me a little bit as if that norm emerged out of the discord of this period, at least insofar as the WHO was concerned. On distinguishing, I have distinguished in my work sometimes institutions as sets of rules and as organizations. And for some purposes, that's important. I'm not sure it's very important here. It might be, but the Kadi case is mostly about a rule structure. There is no coherent bureaucracy that runs this was a state-operated, there was a state negotiation in the Security Council, setting up a set of rules, of which there was no agent running the rules. It was done by the states. There was very little agency. So it didn't look much like an organization. And counter-multilateralism applied in that case to the institutional rule structure. In the WHO case, it was very much organizational and appealed to issues of organizational decisions and culture. So I think we see counter-multilateralism with respect to both. And it might be that as we study it more, we find some differences in the pattern that's followed in the two cases, but I don't think it's going to be core to at least the identification of the phenomenon. Where is counter-multilateralism taking us, or where are we? Maybe it's not clear that it's taking us somewhere. There may be some big wave taking us somewhere, and counter-multilateralism is floating on that wave, right? And I'm not giving it necessarily causal impact. But you mean, where is the phenomenon of which counter-multilateralism is part taking us? I think that I think it's part of the same process that leads to regime complexes instead of coherent regimes. I think you go back to world politics is much more diverse than it was 20 or 30 years ago in terms of both the interests and the power of actors. Or to put it a different way, if you take the powerful actors in world politics who have the capacity to block major initiatives and keep things from happening, and whose participation is needed for things to happen, they are much more diverse than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 18 years ago, in terms of final form, but essentially 20 years ago, the US and the European community imposed the WTO on the rest of the world, and I use imposed deliberately. They abolished the GATT, and they gave everybody else the alternative, accept this nice organization that we have created in our interest, or by the way, you don't need to accept it, but by the way, that means you're subject to 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff rates in the United States. That was a blatant coercion, not possible now, simply inconceivable. They as some colloquial expression in the U.S. goes, they saw their chance and they took it. They had a brief period between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of China and others, when the U.S. and Europe had that kind of dominance, call it 1991 and 1997, and they seized it, and they imposed this, and successfully, and it's very hard to change it because it's institutionalized. But that era is gone. So to me, the fundamental fact is that we now, for example, over half of GDP is accounted for by developing countries now. It's very different from when you and I were young academics, right? We're talking about not even the developing countries, the third world, the impoverished countries. So that is, I think, the fundamental underlying change. And on the one hand, that means it's harder to have integrated regimes. Climate change is a good example. There are too many diverse interests and too many blocking coalitions that are possible. So you have this regime complex, greater fragmentation situation. And on the other hand, it means that you have more possible coalitions that have enough resources at their disposal, who are dissatisfied with contemporary organizations, that they can organize something alternatively. When the U.S. and Europe were the only game in town, and they agreed on the established organizations, who's going to challenge them? Except the Soviets, and they didn't do it successfully. So I think we're seeing a situation which is going to have two features, one of which we may like and one which we don't like. The feature we may like is openness. It's harder to control the situation, as the WHO's failure to do so. A lot of NGOs around, there's diverse interests. It's easier for dissatisfied groups to cobble together some coalition that can make a challenge. So that openness may be positive. More innovation, harder to maintain an inert organization that's accomplishing nothing. On the other hand, less integration, more fragmentation. A lot of wasted effort, as I think you were applying, a lot of inefficiency. That's also built into the system.
This evening brought, I think, two surprises to me. The first surprise is that none of the PhD students of the Berlin Graduate School of Transnational Studies took this wonderful opportunity, since they have been tortured for years now with the KKV book, with the Keohane book, and the selection on the dependent variable, that no one took the chance for revenge and asked him whether his presentation was not a selection on the dependent variable case. So I mean, that is my first surprise. And the second surprise is, I mean, this is only possible for someone like Keohane to develop a concept that is able to grasp two things at the same time. Our wonderful European Court of Justice, who bound the United Nations Security Council to the rule of law, and John Bolton under one concept. This is great. Thank you very much. There's a reception outside.